All right, thanks for having me. My name is Michael Weber. I'm a professor of mechanical engineering and deputy director of the Energy Institute at the University of Texas at Austin. And I wrote this book, Thirst for Power, Energy, Water, and Human Survival, which was just published a few months ago. I've been talking to different groups about some of its themes around energy and water, which I thought might be of interest to all of you. The book is about the interconnections of water and energy because both are critical. So we'll talk about both as critical resources. Water is life. A lot of you know that, and energy is wealth or quality of life. They're the two most critical resources for a modern society, and there are a couple of examples that underpin and justify that. When NASA goes looking for life, they go looking for water, and this is a typical headline you might see. Liquid water exists on Mars, boosting hopes for life there, NASA says. So that's a sign that by finding water, there's a chance for life. And certainly over history, different societies and civilizations have understood the importance of water to building a society, and that control of water is related to economic, governmental, and military power. If we go back, actually, anthropologists will talk about a hydraulic or hydrology theory of civilization, which implies there's a connection between civilization with massive water works, that there's no reason to go beyond a city-state of 100,000 or 200,000 people unless you need more people to build massive water systems. And so massive water systems are a way to organize people to work together for a larger society. The Chinese word for politics, I don't know how to pronounce it, Zhengji, I think, is a character that includes 3 drops next to a platform or water dike on the right-hand side. So the 3 drops of water. The word politics actually has water within it. Well, certainly the Romans knew that. As the Romans expanded and built their empire, water infrastructure and aqueducts like the Pont de Gard in southern France shown here, or a major part of Romanizing new territory, building water systems. And other empires around the world built water systems. The Khmer Empire in Cambodia built massive system. A lot of us interpret as a religious temple, which is actually a water structure. And here in the San Francisco Bay Area, there are also water temples built to celebrate the arrival of water, which enabled a population boom in San Francisco. So the good news is that water enables life and civilization, and the bad news is that a lack of water, or drought or scarcity, can undermine a society and cause collapse. And there are books written about this. The book Collapse, How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed, written by Jared Diamond, or The Great Warming, Climate Change and the Rise and Fall of Civilizations by Brian Fagan, both talk about how societies, civilizations come up and then down, and sometimes the trigger of the collapse is ecological strain. The ecological strain is usually or often drought. And there are a couple examples around the world. 3 of the 5 multi-century Chinese dynasties, the Tang and Yuan and Ming dynasties, collapsed at a time coincident with drought. And that research was just published 8 years ago. And the way they discovered this, they went into caves in the western reaches of where the monsoon gets to in China and found stalactites, these mineral deposits accumulating, dropping down from the ceiling. And the mineral record was a year-over-year record that lasted 1,800 years that let the scientists know how wet or dry that year was. And by comparing that stalactite in the mineral record, in the record of wetness, so to speak, or drought, compared that with the written records of the Chinese, which go back thousands of years, it discovered that multi-decade droughts correlated with the collapse of these dynasties, which is pretty interesting. At the same time, you have collapse of other empires. The Roman Empire collapsed at a time coincident with drought. There they looked at caves in France and used ice formations to track how wet or dry each year was. And we learned growing up that the Roman Empire collapsed because of the Visigoths and Ostrogoths and Lombards and Vandals and all these German tribes that invaded the Roman Empire. But it might be those German tribes were coming in because of drought at the fringes of the empire. That drought might have pushed that in. The classic Maya collapse around the same time the Tang dynasty collapsed, that was coincident with drought, spectacular loss of population over just a few decades. And the Khmer Empire in modern-day Cambodia also peaked in the 13th century after when their waterworks collapsed. So water is life, but lack of water is lack of life or lack of civilization. So it's a critical element for modern society. And the other one is energy, which gives us the quality of life or wealth we like. Energy gives us clean water, gives us productive industry. It gives us mobility, that's social mobility. Energy gets us rich so we can move up the social ladder, so to speak. It gives us physical mobility with gasoline and diesel, lets us move around with transportation. It gives us comfortable buildings, it gives us IT, it gives us abundant food, it gives us all the things we want. And we can correlate that access to energy or access to electricity in particular with freedom and other things. This is the International Space Station orbiting around the Earth, heading east over Southeast Asia. North is to the left, south is to the right. And here's the Korean Peninsula coming up. On the right is South Korea lit up at night, and in the middle between there, China is North Korea not lit up except for Pyongyang, the capital. So we could even correlate energy not just with quality of life, but with freedom and access to the liberties that we tend to take for granted in the United States. So energy is good, although energy also has these problems where we worry about running out of energy we like at the price we like it, or resource depletion. We also have to worry about our energy consumption overcoming the environment's abilities to take up the waste products either in the air, land, or water. So that's environmental degradation. Then we also have to worry about the national security implications of our energy trade undermining our foreign policy objectives. So there's the bad news with energy and the good news of energy. There's the good news of water, it enables life. The bad news, which is if you don't have it, then society can come collapsing down. So both of these are really important. And I'm not the only person who says that. Much smarter people say that. In particular, Rick Smalley says that. He was a Nobel Prize winner at Rice University who got the Nobel Prize for discovering Buckminster fullerene, or the buckyballs. This is carbon-60, a very interesting geodesic dome-shaped carbon molecule which enables really novel material properties. And he spent the last few years of his life talking about the 10 grand challenges for humanity. He died about a decade ago, unfortunately. In his list of the top 10 challenges, he put in order: energy at the top, followed by water, then food, the environment, poverty, terrorism and war, disease, education, democracy, and population. And he put them in this order thinking that there's a logical sequence to how you might tackle these problems. Energy's at the top, it's the most important. If we can solve our energy problems, then we can solve our water problems. If we can get ourselves access to clean, reliable, affordable energy, then we can desalt the oceans or move water thousands of miles or dig deeper wells, that kind of thing. Once we solve our energy and water problems, we can solve our food problems because we can use water to irrigate the fields or make deserts bloom. We can use that energy to make fertilizers from natural gas or diesel for tractors, that kind of thing. And once we've sort of solved the problems of getting our food and feeding ourselves, then we can protect the environment, lift people out of poverty. When you lift people out of poverty, you can prevent terrorism and war. And then you move down to education and democracy. Education's ahead of democracy, with the idea being that you need an educated populace to have a well-functioning democracy, although I would suggest that in the United States, we are testing that hypothesis right now. So who knows how that will play out. And the other idea is you can't get to education until you fed people. That people who are hungry and thirsty can't really think about learning because they're hungry. And you have to have the infrastructure in place first before you can have food. So there are a lot of things that have to happen in sequence. Energy and water at the top. Now, most people wouldn't disagree with that energy and water are important. The surprise might be for most people is that they're interconnected, that we use energy for water and water for energy. There's an opportunity here, which is if you have infinite energy, you could have infinite water. If you have infinite water, you have infinite energy, because if you have all the water you need, you could grow biofuels in the desert, you could dam up the rivers and get hydroelectricity and that kind of thing. So infinite of one enables infinite of the other. The bad news is we're not operating in a world of infinite, we're operating in a world of constraints. A constraint in one becomes a constraint in the other. And so shortages cut across from one sector to another. And then the good news is there are some cross-cutting solutions. So that's the arc of this story and the arc of the book and the arc of the lessons, that energy and water are interrelated. That's a problem, but we can solve it. And that's how we can proceed with our thinking. Let me back up and tell you some of the ways we use water for energy. We use water for the power sector, for making electricity at dams. We use water to spin turbines at hydroelectric facilities. So there the water makes electricity. We use water to make steam. That steam spins turbines. The turbines then make electricity by connecting to spinning magnets as well. In fact, steam turbines make about 75%. Steam turbines make about 75% of the world's electricity. It's a very important way to make electricity. And then we use water to cool those steam power plants to bring the steam back down to liquid water to repeat the cycle. So we use water for the power sector. We also use water for fuels production to grow biofuels by irrigation. We use water to extract oil and gas from water flooding, water injection, hydraulic fracturing, some of these techniques that you eject water underground to flush the oil and gas out. We use water to mine coal and uranium and to make steam to refine and upgrade fuels at refineries or biorefineries. And then we use water to transport fuels with tanker ships or barges and that kind of thing. So water is all up and down the energy supply chain, which means the energy supply chain depends on water. And if the water's not there, the energy supply chain has troubles. So this is a vulnerability for the system. And by the way, the energy system puts water quality at risk in the process. You have to worry about coal chemical spills or coal slurry spills, radiation contamination from nuclear fuel processing or nuclear power plants, mining tails from extractive industries where you're making uranium or you're getting copper out of the ground. You have this extra dirty stuff from the mine that might get into the water. You have to worry about thermal pollution where the power plants can actually heat up the water using cold water to cool the power plant. Well, then that water returns hotter and the power plant's cooler. Dams actually lead to thermal pollution where it makes the water cooler. Cool water comes out the bottom of the dam and that can disturb reproductive patterns for fish. Biofuels runoff is a major issue as we grow biofuels from corn, for example, and we add fertilizers or nitrogen-laden components. They flood into the waters and give it a lot of nutrients and pollution. Oil spills certainly make the news every time you see a picture of a bird wrapped up in oil. And then chemical injection, for example, with hydraulic fracturing is just one more way that energy puts water quality at risk. And that's the newest one that gets a lot of news, but it's not the only one by any means. So energy puts water quality at risk as something we have to keep in mind as one of these downside risks of the energy water nexus. All right, we use water for energy. There's some risks. Supply chain depends on it. Let's talk a little bit more about how we use water for energy at dams. This is a picture of Scientific American from 1892. The cover of Scientific American had a picture of the Great Dam across the Colorado River at Austin, Texas. That's my hometown. And this dam was the largest in the world in 1892. And the modern capacity of that dam is 16 megawatts, which is actually a pretty small power plant by modern standards. So this huge dam in 1892 is like a baby dam today. It's not that big. I've walked across the top of it before, and it's scary for me, but not really that tall overall, 16 megawatts. And that Colorado River, just so you know, is not the same Colorado River that carved the Grand Canyon. It's a different Colorado River. There are two different ones in the United States. Well, that little baby dam today was the world's largest 125 years ago or so. Well, compare that with the Three Gorges Dam in China, which is 22,000 megawatts or 22 gigawatts, over 1,000 times larger than the little baby dam in Austin. The reservoir of water behind that dam is as long as Great Britain. It is a huge body of water. It's very heavy. It's caused hundreds of earthquakes and hundreds of landslides, and it tilted the Earth on its axis, slowing rotation of the Earth by 0.06 microseconds because there's so much water at a higher elevation, it's upset the balance of mass around the globe. If you are ever late for any meeting ever again, you can blame it on the Three Gorges Dam and the rotation of the axis being a little bit slower. So my students now use that as an excuse when they come in. It's just incredible how large this is, and that's because of the power of water spinning turbines to give us electricity. But we also use water to make steam, to spin steam turbines. I mentioned that before. 1/3 of all the energy consumption in the United States is just to boil water to make steam at power plants. So this is an incredible number because boiling water is not a new technology. This has been around for thousands of years. We're making steam to spin the turbines to make electricity because it's a robust way. It's not a particularly efficient way, but it is a robust way to get a lot of power in one place. So steam turbines are very, very common around the world. And then that steam needs to be cooled back to liquid water so you can use it again. So 1/2, really more like 45% of all water withdrawals every day in the United States is just to cool those steam power plants to bring that steam back down into liquid water so we can start the cycle again. That means there's an incredible amount of water embedded in our electricity system. Now, these are withdrawals. We're withdrawing the water, cooling the power plant, and returning that water. It's not consumption. It's not evaporated. It's very, well, small fractions evaporated. It's mostly just borrowed, so to speak. That means the water needs to be there in the first place, and there's risk of river impacts of entraining or impinging fish or other aquatic life or cooking them in the river if the water's returned too hot. So it's a major issue. It turns out we use more water in these power plants for our light switches and outlets, our electrical outlets, than for our taps and shower heads in our homes. In a home, you might use 150 gallons of water per person per day for a typical American, but then you might use another 300 to 600 gallons of water per day to cool the power plants to make the electricity in your home. You're using more water in your electricity than in your water, which is not obvious. That's kind of a strange concept. That's because that water is out of sight, out of mind at a power plant far away. But we're using water at those power plants to give us the electricity to then give us the water, by the way. In addition, you have oil and gas responsible for a small fraction of water withdrawals, another few percent or so. Something like 1% is for oil and gas extraction, another couple percent is at the refining or chemicals, that kind of thing. So a few percent is evaporated or used to make steam at these industrial activities. So it's a small fraction nationally, but oil and gas locally can be 25% or more of water use if you're in an area with a lot of oil and gas production, if you're using a lot of water for hydraulic fracturing or water flooding, that kind of thing. And you have some watersheds where you have a lot of water used for shale production to produce oil and gas from shale, and then on that same river basin you have natural gas combined cycle power plants that use that gas and use water for cooling. And then you might have a chemical plant or refinery on the same river basin. So you have some of these basins under a lot of stress because of the oil and gas revolution. And some of those shale basins are in places where we have a lot of drought. This is a map of the United States with the shale basins noted in pink and some shades of purple there. A lot of shale basins around the United States. And we can overlay one of the recent drought maps and see that some of those basins overlap with areas that are very water scarce. The Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania has plenty of water available to it, but the shales in West Texas or in Colorado and other places don't have as much water. And that's a challenge if you need that water to produce oil and gas, but the water's not available, or that water's at risk of contamination. That water can also be expensive. It can be something like 50 cents per barrel to get the water, another couple bucks to move the water to the site to inject it, then take it away. And that adds up a lot of costs, and those trucks are a nuisance. Those trucks can kill people or have a spill or have an accident or tear up the roads or make a lot of noise and kick up dust. So people don't really like those trucks, and that price is something the oil and gas industry is very sensitive to. Well, it turns out that water has always been expensive for oil and gas booms. Here's a quote from a prior boom. Many's a time you'd see a man come in, order a quart of whiskey poured in a bowl, and go to washing his face and hands. Damn good reason for that. Water had to be hauled miles, and it cost like blue blazing hell. It took many hundreds of barrels of water to drill a well those days, but water cost $3 a barrel. This is a quote not from the shale boom in 2008, but from Burnett, Texas in 1939 from a story in Cosmopolitan magazine. Just in case you're wondering what I do with my free time, I read old issues of Cosmo because I want my updates on the latest fashion tips and that kind of thing. So this idea of a boom is not new. The idea of water being important, expensive, or a limiting factor on a boom is also not new. It's something we keep learning again and again. All right, we use water for energy. We also use energy for water. We use energy for water because the global hydrologic cycle, or the water cycle, is a very powerful cycle and it has plenty of water, but that water is available in the wrong form, the wrong place, or the wrong time of year. 97.5% of that water is salt water. 2.5% is fresh water. Most of the water is salty. That means it's available in the wrong form. It's also in the wrong place, like on top of a mountain or far away on a different continent. And it's also available sometimes the wrong time of year. In India, all the fresh water comes in 1 month during the monsoons, but not the other 11 months. So we spend energy to get it to the right place, our homes, in the right form, fresh water, at the right time of year, which is whenever we want it. So there's energy there to overcome the limits of the hydrologic cycle, bringing us the water as we like it. And that's because water generally seems to be just out of reach. In fact, our mythology and our literature and our culture captures this idea that water's just out of reach. There is a famous rhyme or a verse, water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. It's cliche, it's been said many times. And this is by Samuel Taylor Coleridge from 1798 from the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is a collection of verses and poems. This is the same collection that gave us the idea of the albatross around our neck, by the way, this burden we carry with us. Well, in this case, it's a mariner on a ship surrounded by salt water. Water, water everywhere, but not any drop to drink because it's just out of reach. It's too salty for consumption, and that's a challenge. The word tantalize is also in its roots related to water. Tantalus was a Greek figure who misbehaved and was punished by the Greek gods, given eternal thirst, and put in a pond surrounded by fresh water. Every time he would bend over to drink the water, the pond would recede out of reach. The water was just out of reach. And so the word tantalize means water is just out of reach. That's the situation. These rhymes, these Greek gods, well, we can use energy to overcome the power of the Greek gods and bring that water within reach. We use energy for treating, desalting, heating, chilling, pressurizing, moving water, that kind of thing. We either move the people to the water or the water to the people. And in a modern era with modern energy, we move the water to the people. You cannot explain Los Angeles or Phoenix or Las Vegas without modern energy bringing fresh water to those locations. They could not support the populations they currently do. So we use energy for water. Well, in many parts of the world, that energy comes from manual labor, and it's usually from women, sometimes from children as well. The cliche or stereotypical image of poverty is a woman, usually a sub-Saharan African woman or a Southeast Asian woman, carrying water by hand. Sometimes the kids carrying that water by hand as well, or on their head. This is the image of poverty, manual effort to get water. And in America, we sort of forget that that is a reality. We have a switch or a valve that operates and brings that water for us. But that sub-Saharan African woman or Southeast Asian woman bringing water to our home by hand was an American woman less than 100 years ago. This is a promotional poster called The Farm Woman's Dream, put out in 1920 by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And it says, make your dream come true, consult your county agent, or write to your College of Agriculture for information on water supply systems for farm homes. This is an information piece saying, women, go get information about piped water so you don't have to carry the water by hand. It shows a poor woman in rags and shawls, not even gloves, in cold weather, having pumped water by hand into 2 buckets, carrying it up an icy pathway to the barn and farm, I don't know, quarter mile, half a mile away, a lot of burden to get that water there. And her dream, in the top of the image, is wearing a nice dress, inside the kitchen, turning on a valve, and water comes out, steam curling to the ceiling. That was the idea, that we could get modern energy systems and pumps and heaters to replace the manual water systems, thereby liberating women and increasing the quality of life for a lot of people. That was our approach, and that approach still works for a lot of other parts of the world. We're not that removed in time from the modern woman struggling to bring water to her house. Well, that chore is now a toy. So this is a picture of the old botanical garden in Munich, Germany from this summer. I was there with my boys, David on the right and Maverick on the left, and they're fighting over who gets to pump the water by hand, because they've never pumped water by hand in their entire life. They don't even know what a water pump is, basically, and they're pumping the water by hand. It's now a joy, and it used to be a chore. That's how magical energy systems have been for us. They've liberated from this chore, so now we fight to do it because it's kind of a novelty. Well, in total, as a consequence of all that, water is responsible for more than 12% of national energy consumption. We have a lot of our energy consumption embedded in heating, treating, chilling, pressurizing, moving water to the way we want it and the place we want it. That's a big number. That's about twice as large as all the energy we spend for light bulbs. So water is a pretty important consumer of energy. And 1/3 of that is just for water heating. That's just to get the water to the right temperature. And that means 4% or so of national energy consumption is in water heating. We spend more energy heating our water than Switzerland uses in a year for all purposes, or Switzerland and Sweden combined, really, I should say. So that's a lot of energy, and that's too bad when we use primary fuels for that. We could use waste heat. There's a lot of waste heat around. We could use other forms or solar energy to do the heating for free. So there's a lot of energy embedded in our water systems. All right, there's water for energy, there's energy for water, they're interconnected, and that energy-water relationship is under strain. What that means is a water constraint can become an energy constraint, and an energy constraint can become a water constraint. And I'll give examples of all of these. Let's talk about my home. In May 2011, I got this note on my house, boil water notification, due to a loss of water pressure from a power outage at the water plant where I live, the Ridgewood Village water system. We required all public water system users to boil their water until further notice. The power went out, and therefore the water went out. So we couldn't guarantee the water was clean, so we had to boil the water. This is an example of how dependent the water system is on energy, and therefore if the energy is not there, the water system can't be trusted. Well, for us, it's not that big a deal. We turn a knob, we can boil the water, or we go to the local grocery store and get a jug of water or a bottle of water. But for that little girl in Africa or India or somewhere else, it's a big burden. They have to walk a couple of miles to get the water, carry it by hand or on their head back to their home, and they're not in school while they're doing that or engaged in the economy in other ways. And then that water might be dirty, so they have to walk another couple of miles to get the fuel wood or the cow dung or the straw or whatever it is they're going to burn and bring it back. And by the way, they're at risk of assault or kidnap both times that they're unsupervised going to get these resources. They burn that cow dung or wood in a primitive cook stove in a place that's not well ventilated, and there's so much soot and ash that comes out of this primitive cook stove burning a primitive fuel to boil that water that 4 million women and children die prematurely every year. And so if we can get to more advanced, cleaner water systems or pipe systems or better forms of energy, we can save a lot of millions of people's lives. My inconvenience at home, the energy went out, therefore I had to boil water, is a life or death situation for other people around the world. And that's just one example. Many examples where the energy went out and therefore the water went out. Well, it goes the other way around as well. If the water is not available and the energy system depends on it, the energy system can fall apart as well. In particular, the power sector, because it depends so heavily on water. The water can be too hot with a heat wave, or too cold with a freeze, too abundant with a flood, or too scarce with a drought, and then the power system has trouble. The water's got to be just right. It has to be like Goldilocks water. It can't be too hot, too cold, too abundant, or too scarce. And I'll give examples of each. In 2003, there was a killer heat wave in France. This is a map put out by NASA showing the temperatures in France. Anywhere there's a red dot, it was 10 degrees Celsius hotter than normal, 18 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than normal. And it was literally a life or death situation. About 15 to 20,000 people died in France from that killer heat wave. It was about 70,000 people died across the entire continent of Europe from the heat wave. Because there was a heat wave, the demand for power was higher for air conditioning. So people are turning on the air conditioners, power demand was higher. At the same time, because there was a heat wave, the rivers were hotter. And the French power fleet, which is mostly nuclear, and nuclear power plants need a lot of water for cooling, couldn't get the cooling they needed from those rivers, which were hotter than normal because of the heat wave. And so the demand for power was up, but the supply for power was down, and this strained the grid a lot. Eventually, the French government had to suspend the environmental rules to let the nuclear power plants use hotter water than normal, despite the ecosystem risks, just to get the power they needed because people were dying. So water can be too hot, and that's a problem for the system. Water can also be too cold. In Texas in 2011, we had a freeze, a deep freeze. Now in Texas, a deep freeze means it got to freezing temperatures for 30 hours straight. People in the Northeast would laugh at this because it freezes for months at a time in many places in the United States. But in Texas, we're not prepared for it. We don't weatherize our power plants the same way. And because the weather got really cold, a couple power plants tripped offline because water lines at the coal plants, 2 different coal plants, water lines froze, the plants tripped offline. We lost like 2 gigawatts of power simultaneously. Huge power plants. Well, at the same time the power tripped off, it was getting electricity to electric compressors to move natural gas. So a lot of natural gas systems turned off when the electricity went out. So the pumps and compressors that put gas into the pipelines. At the same time, because it was cold, the natural gas demand was quite high. Because the demand was quite high, we use gas for heating our homes in Texas, the demand for gas is high, the pressure in the gas lines was low. So the pressure in the gas lines was low, then the power goes out at 2 power plants that drive the electric compressors that put gas in the pipelines. The gas pipelines got even lower in pressure. Because the gas pipelines were lower in pressure, 50 to 60 natural gas power plants that tried to come on to back up those 2 coal plants couldn't come on. At the same time, because it was a freeze, we're producing oil and gas out of the ground. Water comes with that oil and gas. It would freeze and clog the pipes. It's called a freeze-off. So we had even less gas to put on the lines, and eventually we had rotating blackouts. So we had a water problem, a freeze, become a power problem at coal plants, which became a gas problem, which became a bigger power problem. So it's this cascading infrastructure problem where a problem in one becomes a problem in the other. Other examples where ice blocked barges or lakes and coal couldn't be delivered, for example, or the ice had to be broken above dams so the dams wouldn't be damaged. In 2014, there was a polar vortex event that caused one of the Midwestern rivers to freeze. When that river froze, barges delivering salt could not move and could not deliver the salt. Because the salt couldn't be delivered, the roads could not be de-iced. Because the roads could not be de-iced, diesel trucks carrying propane could not deliver propane. Because propane couldn't be delivered, people died from the cold in upper Wisconsin and other places like that. So you have a river in one state become an energy problem, become a death in another state. That's how interdependent our infrastructures are, and a problem in one cascades through the others. That's the energy-water nexus working against us. We can also have too much water. This is the nuclear power plant in Nebraska along the Missouri River in 2011. Everywhere it's gray, that's water. That's not good. You're not supposed to have electricity and water mix. And all that gray is where the flood came to. There's a little circle of dry patch right around the nuclear power plant where inflatable berms were put into place. These berms are like a couple feet tall just to keep the river at bay. The river came up to the top of the berm and then came back down. Didn't quite go over it. They were within 1 day of turning off that nuclear power plant. But that flood would have been problematic. With Fukushima in Japan, it wasn't the earthquake that was the problem. It was the flood or tsunami that was the problem. That's where you really got the challenges. So you can have too much water, and then you can also have too little water. I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times, July 24th, 2012, where I boldly predicted that drought would cause the next blackout. Well, 1 week later to the day, drought caused the largest blackout in the world in India. 620 million people in the dark for a couple of weeks because the power went out, and the power went out triggered by drought. The drought caused farmers to irrigate their fields more because they weren't getting the rain for the crops. And they irrigated their fields using electric pumps. So they turned on their pumps, and that meant the demand for power was up. Well, at the same time there was a drought, there was less water for dams, so the power supply was down. So you had less power supply and more power demand because of the drought, and that caused the whole system come crashing down. Now, there were other issues going on, bad governance, bad investment in the grid, people stealing electricity. That had been going on for decades, but drought was the final straw. And I felt really brilliant for calling it a week before, although I will admit that I've been pitching that op-ed to the New York Times for 4 years. They just happened to run it the week before, so the timing was funny. Well, that idea of a drought causing electricity shortages is happening today. It's happening in Venezuela. Venezuela is having a hard time because of low oil and gas prices, having trouble just running their country. Well, on top of that, now they have power shortages because they get so much of their electricity from dams, and the water systems are low, so they have less power. So the president of Venezuela has gone on TV urging women to stop using hair dryers and offered alternative styling tips as the country's energy crisis continues. Basically saying, women, don't use hair dryers, let your hair go natural, you look better anyway, and we don't have the power to spare it. And this is really incredible, and that's because an electric hair dryer is about 1.5 kilowatts of power. It's like an electric car. And if you have millions of them on at the same time, that's a big power spike. That's hard to manage if you don't have the spare capacity in your system. Now think about that. That's water at a dam to make electricity for a hairdryer to get rid of water from your hair. So that's the energy-water or water-energy-water nexus or something like that. Well, I'm trying to think what would happen in the United States if we had a president telling us how to style our hair and how that would be received. So that could be really tricky. Now, by the way, this is how Donald Trump would look in Austin with his man bun. That'd be like very different. So that's how severe they could be. People would be in the streets with pitchforks over that one. Well, trends imply that these strains will be exacerbated for a variety of reasons, and that, in fact, we might even fight over some of these resources, that water will become the next great strategic resource over which we wage battle, not oil anymore. Whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting over. That's what the American West proverb says, that water is something that we are willing to go to battle for. Well, certainly Hollywood catches this. If you look at The Road Warrior from 1981, it was all about fighting over oil. And then Mad Max Fury Road in 2015, it's all about fighting over water. So even Hollywood gets it. So we can take that as some sort of guidance. And when has Hollywood been wrong before? Yeah. We can actually think about conflicts around the world today that are tied to water. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a very complicated conflict, many layers to that one, many religious and other historical layers, but water is a part of that. Israelis say there'll be no water until there's peace, and the Palestinians say there'll be no peace until there's water. Water inequity is one of the parts of that conflict. The Syrian conflict and the Syrian refugee crisis is also tied to water. Water shortages in the rural areas because of drought. You have bankrupted a lot of farmers. Bankrupted farmers move to the cities. You have very large bankrupt and unemployed populations in the cities. Well, that's a problem. Overlay on that oppressive government, autocratic government, things like that. And you get a refugee crisis that's having effects on global elections in England with Brexit and with Donald Trump in the United States and perhaps Italy and Germany as well. That's all tied to drought at its origins. The ISIS takeover of a dam above Mosul, threatening hundreds of thousands of people with a water device there. And today's tension between India and Pakistan also tied to water. We missed this. There were some big headlines, but we missed it because of our presidential election. But India and Pakistan risk going to war over water around the 1960 treaty over the Indus River and how they share the water from that river, which spans the two countries. And I think this comment really gets it very well by the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Blood and water cannot flow simultaneously. That as long as water is not flowing, blood will, and if blood is flowing, the water won't, and this kind of thing. That there's conflict here. We have to make the water flow so that the blood won't anymore. There won't be conflict. And this matters for us because these are nuclear countries, and they're actually trading nuclear threats. We missed all this. It didn't even make the news, really, in the United States very much, that this water war could get really ugly. And there are trends to imply that this isn't unique to just those two countries, that this is a global issue. That because of population growth, we'll have more people, and those people want energy and water, and economic growth, those people want more energy and water per person, and climate change, which distorts rainfall and snowmelt patterns and intensifies droughts and floods, will make it even more complicated. And then we have policy choices where we're choosing more energy-intensive water and more water-intensive energy. We're making it worse. We're shooting ourselves in the foot, so to speak. So the trends look really difficult, and we better manage this. Now, the good news is that there are technical, social, and policy solutions available to us. I don't have time to really go through all of them, but we can talk about that in Q&A. But there are solutions. We think about fuel switching to energy sources that are water lean. We can switch to water sources that are energy lean. We can think about enhanced technologies, more data, distributed technologies, smart technologies, use a ubiquitous sensing and cheap computing to manage our systems in a more optimal way. And then we could also go to cross-sectoral problem solving where we integrate the systems so they prop each other up rather than our vulnerable interdependent systems we have today. I'll just give one example here of the tension between carbon dioxide and water in the power sector. This is a chart that shows the carbon dioxide emissions from top to bottom of different power plants in the United States. The higher up it is, the more carbon emissions it has per megawatt hour of electricity. And at the top is coal. Coal is very carbon intensive. It puts out nearly a ton of CO2 or 2,000 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour. And then below that is coal integrated gasification combined cycle, an advanced form of coal. Then you get to natural gas combustion turbines and natural gas boilers and natural gas combined cycle below that green line, which is one of the proposed targets for CO2 limits. And then you get down to the lower ones, they're cleaner ones, like carbon capture on coal or nuclear or small modular reactors or wind and solar or PV and that kind of thing. So we can stack them up from the most carbon intensive to the least carbon intensive, and we want to get cleaner in general. But on the x-axis, if you add in their water intensity, it gets more complicated. Some of these low carbon solutions like nuclear are really water intensive. Some of the low carbon solutions like capturing the CO2 from coal where you use water actually to do the capture is very water intensive. Biofuels are not here. Biofuels are very water intensive. So if we're not careful, we can decarbonize while increasing the water intensity. There's a tension between the two. And so we should be more thoughtful and go to things that are clean and lean rather than thirsty and dirty. We want to go to the options that are low carbon and low water, which are like wind and solar panels, natural gas combined cycle, maybe coal with carbon capture and dry cooling, maybe the small modular nuclear reactors that have dry cooling, don't use the water, that kind of thing. So there's a smaller set of options that meet these different goals. That's a set of solutions we could consider. We could also look at waste or wastewater as a resource in particular. Wastewater generated around the world, we have a lot of it, and we could take that wastewater, reclaim it, treat it again, and then drink it. And it's less energy to treat that wastewater and drink it than it is to desalt the oceans. This is kind of gross. People call that toilet to tap. Sounds kind of weird, but places like Singapore do that for 20% of their fresh water. And the International Space Station, ISS, does that. Water is so heavy, it's over 8 pounds per gallon, and so you have to lift it. It's something like $50,000 per pound to lift stuff to space. It's so expensive to lift fresh water to space. It's easier to take the water that's used in space for washing hands or from urine or sweat, collect it, treat it again, and have the astronauts drink that. And I would say good enough for astronauts, good enough for me. We can do that in society as well. By the way, we kind of already do that with our rivers. We take our wastewater, put it in the river, and then the next city drinks it. It feels different there because like nature cleaned it for us or something, but we can close the loop, put it through pipes, and clean it along the way. That's one technical solution. There are many more. There's also water harvesting and reuse, like showers to flowers. Take the gray water from our showers, irrigate our flower beds. We could also use gray water for snowmaking. Killington, Vermont does that. It's a ski resort. People cattily say about that, well, that's where the affluent meet the effluent. It's where the rich people meet the gray water for snow. So there's a couple different things we can do, and there are catchphrases that might or might not be accurate about it. But we can take the water and use it again. Think of wastewater as a resource. There are also policy solutions and challenges. I'm going to go back to Kennedy in the 60s, who made some clarion calls for society to go on a technical pathway to take us to new frontiers. And the famous one is from May 1961. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish as sending man to the moon and back before the decade is out. That was a call for the space race, and we responded as a nation. Well, a month before, he had said, if we could ever competitively, at a cheap rate, get fresh water from salt water, that would be in the long-range interest of humanity and would really dwarf any other scientific accomplishment, making a similar kind of call, but around water and getting water out of salt water so we could drink it. Well, we responded to one and put a man on the moon, but not really to the other. While he did increase the spending for R&D for water, that was ended in the Reagan administration and hasn't really picked back up. In fact, we spent more money looking for water on Mars and Moon than we have on R&D for water on Earth, which I think is sort of telling. So that's an opportunity. We could invest in R&D. Even if we do invest in R&D, it's going to take a while. And so we might ask ourselves, well, what do we do while waiting for new technologies? Well, I think we should improve our education, improve our energy and water literacy with better STEM education. This initiative I'm working on right now, I've created an interactive energy water course app or curriculum called Resourcefulness based on the book I wrote. And it teaches key concepts on energy water for different K through 12 students or people around the world. And I partnered up with a startup, Disco Learning Media, I'm affiliated with, and a corporate sponsor, Itron, to make it available for free around the world. Making a curriculum, make it available for free. That's one thing we could do. Along the way, we have to improve STEM education and recognize that energy literacy and STEM education go hand in hand. And we have to think about how the Earth without art is just So some people suggest we need to add the A and make it STEAM education. We need to go from STEM to STEAM. Thank you for laughing at that joke. I think it's a good one. My sister's an art teacher, so I appreciate the art. But we need to make it more visual, get the creative people, get the visual people involved with it. And we should ramp up on conservation. Conservation is one of those answers that just makes a lot of sense. And for this, I look to The Onion for guidance. This is where I go to get my news because it's more accurate than the news. The Onion. And here's the latest story. Impoverished child in third world dreams about one day leaving light on for no reason. This is what poverty is. Poverty dreams to be rich so we can just waste stuff without worrying about it. Well, that's a very damning indictment of who we are as modern Americans, how much we waste, right? We leave the light on for no reason, leave the water on for no reason, throw things away when we could recycle it. And conservation is a good counter trend to that. In April, I got to hear Ban Ki-moon, the former Secretary General of the United Nations, speak, and he said this, and I really love this sentence: use energy and water sparingly. Even a single drop of water is precious. Even a single drop of water is precious. I think that's the right mindset. And the good news about conservation and saving that drop of water is that conservation works at many scales. It's the only solution I can think of that works at every time scale, from now through centuries, and every spatial scale from a few square feet to continental size. We can make decisions today, this afternoon, to turn off the light as we leave the room or turn off the water, that kind of thing. We can also redesign our cities and our water systems to last hundreds of years. We can save energy in the space we control here or work on urban design that spans much larger areas. We can buy new cars every decade or so, new appliances that have longer lifetime that are more efficient. So we have conservation as a tool available at every level, and it's unusual. Most solutions are one or the other. And I'll close with this last comment. from when my daughter and I, a decade or so ago, would brush our teeth together. My daughter is now 17, and she said this when I was 7, and I really thought I captured the moment well. We used to brush our teeth together every night, just as a father-daughter ritual, and we would get our toothbrush and we would wet it under the tap and then turn the water off to brush our teeth. We'd turn that water off while brushing, and that would save like a gallon or 2 of water. Then we turn the water back on to rinse and then turn it back off. Well, one time I didn't turn the water off fast enough to her liking, and she made a face and scowled at me and made a fist and looked at me and said, "Turn off the water, Daddy. The scientists need time." And it's sort of this gripping, dramatic thing that only a 7-year-old could do. And I was really blown away, and I thought she really captured it, that conservation buys us time, and that kids really understand the importance of conservation, and then we beat it out of them in high school and college. But she understood, like, it buys us time. Conservation is a great solution. It's not the final solution. It's not the only solution. It's hard to light a light bulb with conservation. It's hard to eat conservation. It's hard to drive to work on conservation. But conservation buys us a lot of time. And in that meantime, those decades that we can really use, we can invent better market solutions, better technologies, that kind of thing. So that's really what it's about, is buying ourselves the time we need to make better decisions. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks for a wonderful speech.
Yeah.
And one of the things I wanted to ask was where you put out that slide of the 10, what was that?
Oh, the 10 grand challenges for humanity? Yeah.
And where, I thought it was interesting. Of course, energy, water was right on top, population at the end. See,
Yeah.
I come from India, and I tend to believe that a lot of the problems in India are because of the population.
Yes.
And whether that should be 10 or it should be much higher?
I get so of this list, the question I get the most is always, is population really number 10? Or should it be number 1? Or where does it belong? And I think, and I don't know, this is Smalley's list, so I don't know exactly his logic. But there are a couple of reasons why I think he put it number 10, which is the ways to deal with population. Well, there are many levers to deal with population. Many of them are very ugly. But the best ways are through urbanization and through education. And as societies urbanize, birth rates go down. And as women, or really girls, are educated, birth rates go down. So you can't tackle population unless you tackle education. And you can't tackle education unless you tackle the other things. And then you also don't have urbanization unless you have energy and other things settled, because that's when people move into cities. So I can understand why he might put that last, although I think from a lot of anecdotal experience, people would say, oh, there's just too many of us, so we had to have fewer people. But the policy levers are so gross for that one. And I think it's better to tackle from the more pleasant way. Well, if we educate people and urbanize and go to industrial society instead of an agricultural society, then population will take care of itself. So I think that's the thinking he had behind it. But it's a great question. I get that question every time.
And possibly also, I think, this is his proposed, what he thinks of are the greatest challenges and how it would be handled. But I think what we are saying is the problem that we face is because of the population.
Yeah, so maybe population is 10th on the list of solutions, but it's first on the causes or something like that. Yeah. Perhaps, you might say bad governance and other, there might be other causes along with it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, great question, great comments. And what I recommend is you go get your Nobel Prize and you have your better list. So otherwise we defer to him. But yeah, I totally get it. I think that's a good point.
Michael, thank you. A quick question for you is if you look in certain energy markets, the growth of solar and wind or intermittent power generation, one of the ways in a sort of transition to a renewable energy economy is to back them up with gas generation.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you've seen places where gas generation has not been permitted or allowed because of water. Is that a concept that is a sort of Tomorrowland thing, or if that's something you've seen here and now?
No,
that question make sense?
Yeah, it totally makes sense. So I'll come back to do you need gas to back up what is solar second, but let me first talk about gas and permitting, because it might not be true that you need gas to back it up, at least from our experience in Texas. But certainly there are power plants that are having trouble getting permitted if they don't have the water. And natural gas combined cycle power plants use half the water as a coal plant. They're half the carbon and half the water. So natural gas combined cycle is much cleaner and leaner than a coal plant, but much thirstier and dirtier than, say, a wind farm or something like that. And whether you think natural gas is a step in the right direction or wrong direction might depend on whether you believe in zero or the coal as your baseline. But natural gas combined cycle does need some water for cooling. And there are power plants in Texas that couldn't get the water and had to go to dry cooling to build their power plant. Dry cooling uses air for cooling. Now, you can use air to cool your power plant instead of water. It's just not as efficient, it's more expensive, and it's harder to do. Imagine burning your hand on something really hot. Would you want to put your hand in front of a fan to cool it or under cooling water? You'd rather use cooling water rather than a fan, but if you can't get the water, you'll take a fan if you got no other choice. And that's the way it is for some power plants. They can't get the water, so they change their design, and then they're less competitive as a consequence, or they don't build at all and they build something else. So certainly it's an issue, especially like in the South, the Southwest, desert Southwest, that kind of thing. It's shifting the technologies and designs, and that can be an issue for it. But if you're using that natural gas to displace a coal plant, you got plenty of water. You can just use the coal plant's water. So it might depend on whether it's new build or brownfield and that kind of thing. The other issue is, well, what do we need to back up the intermittent variable renewables? Wind and solar come and go with astronomical conditions or meteorological conditions, or it depends on our position of the Earth relative to the sun and that kind of thing. And it comes and goes. That's a problem for the grid. What do we do? And the thinking for a long time was you need some backup capacity. For every megawatt of wind, you need a megawatt of natural gas on hand to back up. Then over time, people said, well, for every megawatt of wind, you need 0.6 megawatts of natural gas to back it up because the wind doesn't go to zero or that kind of thing. And now we're finding over time, actually, maybe you don't really need more backup as much as you need a really robust transmission and distribution system of wires and poles. So let me talk about the experience in Texas. So just for background, there are 3 grids in America, East, West, and Texas. Texas has its own grid for a variety of historical reasons. In the Texas grid, ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, has had the biggest wind boom basically in the world, although maybe China's had more. But we've had more wind in a smaller area, and we lead the nation in wind power in Texas for a variety of reasons, mostly because we have cheap, flat, windy land, and we have growing demand for power. It's very easy to build a wind farm in Texas, and we've got good wind resources. Well, that wind is variable, and in particular, the wind is strongest at night in March, and weakest in August in the afternoons, which is the opposite of when we need it. We need it to be most robust in August afternoons, and we need it the least at 3 a.m. in March. We built all this wind, and it's variable. And people got very nervous about what this means for the grid. We got to back it up. What are we going to do? This and that. And it turns out that as we built more wind in Texas, we now have like 18 gigawatts of wind in Texas. I mean, this is more wind than most countries have. I think Texas, if it were a country, would be the 5th or 6th largest wind power in the world. We'd also be the 6th largest carbon emitter, by the way. So it would be a pretty dramatic kind of impact. A lot of wind. The costs to manage and regulate the grid have gone down with time. The wind did not increase the variability and did not increase the regulatory services anyway. Because at the same time, we revised our markets to make our markets a little more dynamic. And so you have a smart dynamic market, then your dynamic source, wind, is fine. You can accommodate it. So if you take an old-fashioned 1980s market and put variable wind in, it'll be problematic. But if you have an updated market with more data, smart systems optimized every 4 seconds, we're making a decision in the grid in Texas, and there's frequency regulation that happens at the sub-second level. If you have a really smart market and new rules, then the wind should be fine. So we're finding in Texas actually cost of power went down, and the cost of managing the grid, that went down also. And that's because the market rules changed. Despite the wind, improving the market made it all fine. Now that's true today with 10% of our energy from wind, 20% of our capacity from wind. But what happens when we get to 50 or 80%? It might change. At some point, it might be more difficult. And so we might need to overbuild the wind or overbuild the wires and poles. What happens with the wires and poles is the wind is 500 miles away from the city. You got to move the power long distances. Well, that wind is also built over a large area. So the wind comes and goes with the weather, but we don't build all our wind turbines in one county. We'll spread it out over many, many counties, over large areas. And the wind doesn't come and go in synchronicity. Like it changes from place to place. And by having geographic spread, it kind of smooths itself out a little bit. It's not as big a deal. So by building wind in large places, building lots of wires and poles, and refining the market, we haven't needed to build the backup. It's been okay. Might be different with solar, because the solar goes up and down in more unison. Solar will be more difficult than wind. Wind is a little more, not random, but more stochastic, I will say. So anyway, great question about the natural gas. We're finding we haven't needed it so far. Maybe we'll hit that point sometime soon. But smart markets and data are a critical part of that solution.
It's so hard to watch floods in the Midwest when the Mississippi is flooding, and we're out here in the West, we're so dry.
Oh, always, yeah. There's always a drought somewhere, or there's a flood somewhere else at the same time. And it's like, if we could only move that water.
I know, but I'm sure it's the expense, right? What prevents us from doing it?
So we could move the water, say, from the Mississippi out west, or really people talk about the Yukon River, moving the water from Canada or the Pacific Northwest or Alaska down to the desert Southwest where we could really use it. People talk about flooding the Rocky Mountain Trench, like through Utah and that kind of thing. And if you look it up on YouTube, there's some great videos from 1950s for the Parsons Project, I think, about moving water thousands of miles from Canada and Alaska down to the US to the desert Southwest. It would cost tens of billions of dollars to build it. it would flood a lot of area, it'd have huge ecosystem impacts, it would displace a lot of people, and then it would take a lot of energy to move that water. So you could do it, it's just there are a lot of impacts. And then if you add up all the costs, it's easier just not to water your lawn in the end. Where we have a lot of places where we waste water, and maybe we don't need as many golf courses or that kind of thing. So it's really expensive and really impactful. At the same time, we do some version of that. In California, water is moved hundreds of miles from north to south. In Hawaii, on Maui, water is moved dozens of miles from one part of the mountain to the plains where the sugar plantations are. In China, they move water a couple thousand miles and have nuclear power plants basically dedicated just to pumping that water from one river to another. So we do water transfer projects all the time. The Romans did, as I mentioned, but usually those are smaller scale than what people are talking about, moving the floods of the Mississippi River or the water from the Yukon River to the desert Southwest. It just gets to be so big and expensive and hard to manage that other options look more appealing. Great question.
I have a question.
Yeah.
On your last slide with all of the possible options, like all of the possible solutions.
Yeah.
The last one that you mentioned was making plants such that the water and energy build each other up.
They're integrated rather than interdependent.
Exactly. Can you speak a little bit more about
Yeah, that's great. So right now, I would say our systems are interdependent. They depend on each other, but not necessarily in a thoughtful way, a vulnerable way. A problem one becomes a problem together. But we could do good integrated engineering design where we design them to prop each other up. One example is using wind in West Texas or other place where you have abundant wind and you have abundant brackish groundwater. Brackish groundwater is water that's a little bit salty below ground. And you can use that wind to pump it and treat it because pumping and treating water takes a lot of energy. And if you use a coal-fired power plant, it will emit a lot of CO2. So we could use the renewable energy to increase the robustness of our water supply. And at the same time, by doing the water pumping and treatment with the wind, we serve the grid because that variability of the wind is a problem. You just asked about that. The variability of the wind is a problem. Maybe we need a backup power plant of gas, or we just have some load that ramps up and down to match when the wind is available, which could be water treatment. Could also be data centers, could be other manufacturing processes. Water treatment and pumping can be done in a variable way. So in this case, you integrate the two, you solve an electricity grid balancing problem, and you solve a water supply problem. That's one example. Another example is a lot of places where we do shale production, shale oil and gas production. You're using water to crack the shale open and to flush the oil and gas out. In some places, we have a lot of pipelines to gather the oil and move the oil to market, but we don't have the system to gather the gas. And so the gas is flared or burned on site, and those flares are really bright. The flares are so bright, you can see them from space. And so we have places like North Dakota with the Bakken shale, a lot of flares at night in the Bakken. In Texas with the Eagle Ford shale, in South Texas, there's a lot of oil gathering infrastructure, but not gas, so there's a lot of flares at night. Well, at those shale production sites, you have a lot of water you need to put into the shale formation to crack the shale. It gives you a lot of nasty wastewater. You get produced water that flows back out with oil and gas. So at that site, you have a lot of flared gas that's waste energy and a lot of nasty water. Water is way too salty to drink. Well, you could take that flared gas to treat that water, and you solve two waste products at once, and you get drinking water afterwards, or water you could use for some other purpose. So that's like you integrate the two so they prop each other up rather than cause each other to come crashing down. Those are just a couple examples. There's more. You could do water harvesting in homes to collect rainwater, gray water, use that as a thermal storage mechanism for your air conditioning or heating, and you solve an energy problem and a water problem simultaneously. So that's I think where we need to go. And then integrated metering and integrated data is another way to go as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me.